This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Newbron, and here are tonight's top stories from East Asia. Markets in Asia staging a comeback from a historic global sell-off sparked by fears of a U.S. recession. China competition in the Pacific and nuclear submarines in focus as U.S. and Australian foreign and defence ministers prepare for annual talks. Japan marks the anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, which helped to end World War II. Tens of thousands of people gathered, including ambassadors from more than 100 countries. South Korea in the grip of a heatwave, the death toll rising as temperatures top 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in years. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, a rural county in South Korea appears to have found a formula to reverse the country's low fertility rate. Could it be replicated elsewhere? Well, we have an expert to weigh in. But let's start with the roller coaster ride in financial markets as Asian equities roar back to life following yesterday's meltdown. Roland Lim with us now. Roland, the global rout appears to be short-lived, but there are still lingering concerns, aren't there?
Definitely lingering concerns, Jill. Equities are rebounding from that historical panic selling which afflicted almost every risk asset amid fears of a U.S. recession. Extreme valuations in the tech sector and a strengthening Japanese yen also fueled the selling. As financial officials seek to calm investors, the risk-on mode appears to have returned by some degree. Leading the recovery in Asia is the Nikkei 225. The index saw double-digit gains to record its largest daily increase since October of 2008. The broader-based Topics Index also gaining more than 9% today. Yesterday's sell-off saw the Nikkei plunge more than 12%. That was its biggest one-day fall since the Black Monday crash of 1987. And the yen, as you can see, currently is weaker against the greenback by 0.4%, 144.80 to $1. Elsewhere, South Korea's Kospi and Taiwan's weighted index also gaining by about 3% each. Now, both indices lost more than 8% the previous session. For the TAIEX, though, it was the most on record. Now, Chinese markets struggled to rise despite the rebound in regional markets. Both the Shanghai and Shenzhen bourses finished somewhat flat. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index, though, bucking the trend, ending the day in the red, failing to hang on to earlier gains. For more analysis on the markets, we're joined now by Daryl Ho. He is Senior Investment Strategist at DBS Bank. Daryl, good to have you with us. A reprieve of sorts for the markets today. How much more volatility are you expecting and for how much longer?
It's a good question. We do understand that the yen carry trade has been largely behind a lot of these very excessive moves that we're seeing in the market over the last 2 days. We just want to be a bit aware of the carry trade, right? The weakening in the yen has run for about 3 or 4 years. So to say very confidently that it's been done over in just about a week would be perhaps a little bit too premature. We do think that we have to be a bit more careful, knowing that the yen has been on just really one direction over a pretty long time. So for a complete unwind of that directional trade, we might need to see a little bit more volatility down the road, just so that a lot of the positioning that has accumulated over the last many years can be reversed.
Just to be clear, do you think the market's bottomed out yet? If not, what are the moving parts that we still have to watch out for?
So we've only seen one instance of policy data, right? So if you look at what's happened in the proximity of a couple of days, we've seen the Bank of Japan hike rates a little bit, but also very close to that, we also saw the labor markets in the US start to weaken a little bit. And that kind of initially signified that policy direction between the Japan and the US is moving a bit in opposition to each other, right? Japan is raising rates while the US now has a lot of reason to cut rates. And so in an environment where interest rate differentials start to converge, that is where we start to appreciate the idea that the Japanese yen may no longer be on its depreciating path as has been taken for granted over the last 3 or 4 years. If that's the case, and the policy direction continues as illustrated, it is only fair to assume that the yen could see some strengthening further down the road, which prompts further unwind of this carry trade. Now, again, we would say again that it is a bit early to call an end to the turmoil. The market has only seen a couple of days of volatility, and we would encourage to pay attention to some of the reversal of policy differentials that has really accumulated over the last 3 or 4 years.
Daryl, your house view seems to be that the market sell down presents an opportunity to pick up big tech names with exposure to AI. Corporate fundamentals, they're still on track?
Certainly so. So if you look at our market outlook for the third quarter of this year, we were underweight equities and we're overweight bonds and overweight gold. I think it's been playing out quite accordingly. But specifically for equities, I think we wanted to pay attention to a few things, right? The first thing is that we noticed that consumer savings were trending down, as well as the labor markets were also loosening. So we wanted to encourage a bit more cautious stance on equities. But that said, we were also pretty positive on the fundamentals around big tech, because earnings were still on a mid-double-digit path. And as you've rightly pointed out, I think the fundamentals have not shifted dramatically since the last few weeks. In fact, what we've seen in the markets is really just a multiple contraction that's not actually, is more sentiment driven and more unwinding of the carry trade driven than fundamentals driven. So we do think that this correction presents an opportunity to pick up names that we like in the long-term secular tech trend that we've continued to say investors should be positioned in. Now, there would then necessitate investors to have to put up with some volatility in the interim. But we do believe that in the long run, these secular trends will still remain in place for investors to take part in the tech growth trend.
If you could get a bit specific, how are you advising your clients in this bear market climate, especially when it comes to rebalancing their portfolios, sectors?
Yeah. So I think the first conviction overweight calls with bonds. I think it is very clear now to the markets that policy rates are too high for the direction of travel of inflation, which is downwards, as well as the loosening of the labor markets. Right. So the first the strategy that we have is for investors to take note of how much cash that they actually do have, because cash reinvestment risk is probably going to go down as the interest rate direction comes down as well. So to secure the prevailing yields as we see today, bonds are a surer bet to kind of hedge against the situation where interest rates are on a decline, right? So I think that's the first significant overweight call that we have in the bank. Of course, for equities, we have to be a bit more nuanced. It's going to be a bit more volatile. And so in that regard, we do encourage investors to stay invested with technology names that have exhibit quality growth, and where earnings are still expected to be compounded at mid-double digits over the foreseeable future. Right, and I think these include big tech, healthcare, and select names in the energy sector. So we have to be a bit more careful picking equities in the riskier buckets, and we have to ride out a bit more volatility. But I think in the long run, they would still be able to ride through this volatility.
What about other asset classes? Gold, of course, the traditional safe haven. Where do you see gold prices? Is there the likelihood of breaking that psychological $2,500 level?
Yeah, gold has a different profile, right? So I think the first thing that's also encouraging for gold is that if the interest rate environment does come down, gold has generally been negatively correlated to interest rates. So in other words, if interest rates do come down, the gold price tends to go up. So if we are indeed on the brink of a cutting cycle, that is a bit of a tailwind for gold. And of course, notwithstanding certain other developments around the world, right? I think gold has been traditionally viewed as a geopolitical risk hedge. And so if there's any news of rising conflict, that generally leads to gold and safe haven demand for gold rising. And also we know and we are aware in the background that central banks over the last couple of years have been accumulating gold increasingly as a larger percentage of their reserves. So I think there are a lot of structural tailwinds behind gold, and we have perpetually been bullish on this asset class as a risk diversifier for your portfolios.
Daryl, thank you very much for those market insights. That was Daryl Ho, Senior Investment Strategist at DBS. Japan's top currency diplomat has stressed that the government and central bank are in close coordination in monitoring developments in domestic and international markets. Atsushi Mimura made the remarks after holding emergency talks with officials from the Bank of Japan and the Financial Services Agency following yesterday's sell-off. The BOJ is under heavy criticism after its second rate hike for the year appears to have contributed to a historic plunge in Japanese stocks and markets worldwide. Mr. Mimura refrained from commenting on the government's views on potential drivers of the global market meltdown, but said that the three parties, shared an outlook that the Japanese economy will gradually recover. BOJ Governor Kazuo Ueda is reportedly being called to a parliamentary committee hearing soon for questioning on the central bank's latest policy decision. Meantime, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is set to pledge support for more than $2 billion in Central Asia. Nikkei Asia reports that he will be announcing more than 200 business deals in Central Asia when he visits later this week, focusing on key areas such as decarbonization and digital technology. Mr. Kishida will be attending a summit with leaders of the region's 5 countries this Friday, where he is expected to make the announcement. The state-owned Nippon Export and Investment Insurance will set up a 5-year, $2 billion credit line to underwrite trade insurance for Japanese companies exporting to and investing in Central Asia. He'll be visiting Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan for 3 days, accompanied by representatives of more than 50 Japanese companies. Among the deals likely to be announced, most will focus on decarbonization and digitalization. For instance, Itochu and Kawasaki Heavy Industries, along with state-owned companies in Turkmenistan, will build a plant to produce gasoline and natural gas. Now, industrial group IHI will also be conducting a study on generating power from clean-burning ammonia in Kazakhstan. Now, Toyota, Tsusho, and NEC are believed to be negotiating deals worth more than $160 million to build data centers in Uzbekistan. And you are up to date with the business news. Joe.
Good stuff. Thank you so much, Roland. Now, China's competition in the Pacific, as well as the AUKUS nuclear submarine project, will be among the key talking points between the US and Australian defence and foreign ministers when they meet today as part of the annual Australia-US ministerial dialogue. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin are co-hosting Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence Richard Marles and Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong. Mr. Blinken, ahead of the dialogue, has said that both countries are engaged in an important alliance, and this includes resource exploration, development of supply chains for critical materials, as well as fighting state information manipulation.
This is basically a partnership to work together even more effectively on combating misinformation and disinformation. We know that around the world, we're in an environment in which misinformation and disinformation is unfortunately a tool of choice for countries that are in adversarial relationships with both of our countries.
Defence Secretary Austin also held bilateral talks with Mr. Marles. Washington had agreed to help Canberra produce guided multiple launch rocket systems by 2025 at the last AUSMINT meeting. Now, this cooperation comes against the backdrop of China's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region.
So much has happened over the last few years. You mentioned AUKUS, which is transforming Australia's military capability, but that can't happen but for the partnership that we have. We're seeing America's force posture in Australia grow really significantly. AUKUS is part of that, but it's not the only part of that.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan marks the 79th anniversary of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, with the city's mayor stressing the need for nuclear disarmament to be tackled urgently. We have an expert weigh in on that in just a moment. Japan is marking 79 years since the U.S. atomic bombing in Hiroshima. About 50,000 participants were in attendance, including top Japanese officials and ambassadors from 109 countries. What you're hearing there is the peace bell. It was tolled at 8:15 a.m. local time to mark 1 minute of silence, as well as the exact time the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped on the city in 1945. 140,000 people perished in the blast. You saw their doves being released as dignitaries laid wreaths at a memorial cenotaph. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida now calling for global nuclear disarmament, urging immediate action towards abolishing such weapons.
核兵器のない世界の実現に向けて努力を着実に積み重ねていくことは、唯一の戦争被爆国である我が国の使命です。
Well, let's get more now. We're joined by Dr. Nikolai Sokov. He is Senior Fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Dr. Sokov, first, let me repeat what the Japanese Prime Minister said there. He said, our mission is to continue to make an effort to realize a world free from nuclear weapons. Dr. Sokov, is the world listening? Is it completely possible for nuclear disarmament?
Well, it depends on the timing. I think that, yes, that's a noble goal. Yes, and we're all interested in eliminating nuclear weapons. The question is when. I'm afraid that in the very near future, that might not actually be possible. So at the moment, we should probably be more talking about reducing the risk of nuclear weapons being used. So yes, we live in very difficult and sad, in fact, time.
Yeah, difficult indeed. In fact, you have said, Dr. Sokov, that the nuclear weapons reflect the geopolitical and geostrategic conflict of our time. What are the main geopolitical trends that are accelerating the state of nuclear weapon possession today?
That's actually quite a long talk. It's a whole lecture. But trying to be short, we live in the time of a conflict that will define the future shape of the international system. And the most important, actually, question is who is making the rules in international law, who dominates economically and politically, and so on and so forth. So we see the emerging conflict, very serious conflict, a very fundamental conflict between the United States, its allies and partners on the one hand, and China, Russia, the BRICS, including India, actually, on the other. Some parts of these conflicts are becoming very heavily militarized. Well, of course, it's between the United States and Russia, the entire NATO and Russia, but also increasingly in the Pacific. So until we somehow resolve that conflict, it will be really difficult to see on a lower level of military standoff. Going more kind of specifically to nuclear weapons, I would say that for countries like China and Russia, nuclear capability, nuclear weapons are a compensation for the relative weakness of their conventional forces. Obviously, the United States, its allies and friends are much more powerful in conventional weapons. So the other side does emphasize nuclear. Now, we need to understand that when we talk about nuclear weapons, the normal human logic does not really work in that world. Yes, it's really behind the looking glass. So it's a very, very special, yes, and quite convoluted, actually, logic. You emphasize nuclear weapons, at least in theory, to enhance deterrence and prevent war, right? But at the same time, nuclear weapons are so dangerous that any mistake, any misstep can result in nuclear use in a global catastrophe. So that's really kind of the two sides of the same equation.
Yeah, I just want to talk a bit more about China because you raised it as quite central to this. On one hand, they are actually increasing their nuclear arsenal to perhaps 1,000 by 2030. That's the estimate. On the other hand, don't you feel that countries that have possession of this many nuclear arsenal should really make negotiations as a crucial part to reduce this nuclear threat? China, for example, halting talks with the US over their dispute over Taiwan. As far as the governance of nuclear weapons go, don't you think that talks should be an unconditional criteria to have them?
Well, I spent more than 40 years of my life actually in arms control and disarmament. In fact, yes, I participated in negotiations on almost all key arms control treaties on nuclear weapons. So, of course, my question is yes. The challenge is to how to get there, how to get actually countries to start talking and to negotiate. And for example, between the United States and Russia, the key question is really not about whether they should negotiate about nuclear weapons, but whether, say, negotiations should also include conventional weapons. That's something where actually the Russians feel that they're behind the United States. So that's been one kind of the reasons why nuclear weapons negotiations have not really started for the last about 15 years. China has very similar, is actually challenges, but also China does not have any experience in such negotiations, unlike Russia, for example. So for China, it's really important to convince itself, in fact, that negotiations and arms control are very much in its interest as well as in the global interest. Yes, as far as I understand, Chinese officials, Chinese governments is still actually thinking, yes, and still trying kind of to figure out whether it's a good policy or not. So it will take a lot of effort, and unfortunately, in conflict time, any confidence about the intentions of the other side is very difficult to come by.
Dr. Sokov, final question to you. If complete nuclear disarmament looks far off, the next possible thing, the next best thing, according to you, is risk management. What does that look like on the ground? Quickly.
Yes. On the ground, that would really means constructing the guardrails so that nuclear war does not result from an accident or a misunderstanding of the intentions and actions of the other side. All countries should be constantly in touch, not just over the hotlines that we already have, but also in a faster and technically more and reliable way. They should start also, and that would be the next actual step, to exchange data about armed forces and their activities. So that there are no surprises and no chances to misunderstand the intentions of the other side. So it should be step by step and step by step. I think we have quite good actually possibility to start moving down that road, maybe quite soon, maybe next year. Or in a couple of years, something like that. That's much, much more feasible. So yes, it'll take time, but it's doable.
All right, step by step. Thank you so much, Dr. Nikolai Sokov from the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Coming up on East Asia tonight, China's pet population on track to soon outnumber children under 4 years old. And South Korea, which holds the record of having the world's lowest fertility rate, also facing a demographic challenge. We look at how one bright spot in the rural north is bucking that trend. Markets in Asia staging a rebound from a historic global sell-off sparked by fears of a U.S. recession. Japan marks the anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, which helped to end World War II. Tens of thousands of people gathered, including ambassadors from more than 100 countries. South Korea sees the mercury top 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in years. The countries in East Asia have been confronting a fall in fertility rates over the years. Now, China is no exception, with more couples there seeming to choose pets over having their own children. A Goldman Sachs report recently found that pets are likely to outnumber infants and toddlers in China this year. Analysts estimate the number of pets would close to double the number of children aged 4 or younger within 6 years. Now, they added the younger generation is opting to have more pets than starting families due to the high costs of education and lack of social benefits. The Ministry of Civil Affairs forecast that marriage rates would plunge to the lowest in 45 years. Now, up until June, only 3.4 million couples registered their marriages, and that number is down by nearly 500,000 from a year ago. As part of efforts to reverse that downtrend, China's State Council published a list of directives over the weekend aiming to ease household financial burdens. The plan specifically called for income tax cuts that could offset childcare costs. Now, China, which is home to the world's second largest economy, has been seeing its total population drop for 2 straight years. Last year, fertility rates fell to another record low, with only 9.02 million births reported. South Korea has declared war on its collapsing birth rate, which is now the world's lowest. Its president called it a national emergency last month and pledged to create a new ministry to tackle the population crisis. But a bright spot in the rural north of the country is bucking that trend. CNA's Money Mind, in an earlier episode, finds out how Hwacheon County is delivering on its promises to invest in children.
In the country with the world's lowest fertility rate, the Hong family are bucking the trend. They have 4 children, ranging from 9 to 15. Nine-year-old Mingi is the baby of the family. He comes to this community center straight after school for extracurricular activities. From English, art, culture to sports, all of the classes here are free of charge. It's all part of the local government's policy to boost birth rates by providing education, childcare, and housing, thus taking the financial burden off young families.
다른 데 살았으면은 4명 못 낳았을 것 같아요. 많이 부담이 되고.
Mingi's family lives in the county of Hwacheon near the border with North Korea. The parents first moved here in 2011 with 1 baby in tow. 3 more kids later, they now run a bakery and cafe.
아이들 키우고 양육하고 돌보고 교육적인 부분에 있어서라든지 그런 것들은 하천이었기 때문에 가능한 것이 있어요. 저희 아이들은 어린이 도서관이라든지 여기 화천 커뮤니티 센터라든지 청소년 수련관이라든지 저희들이 일을 마치는 시간과 거의 같아요.
Here in Hwacheon, thanks to a variety of extracurricular activities provided by the county, the family spends less than $400 per month on private piano and taekwondo lessons for their younger two boys.
진짜로 아이들 키우기 좋은 화천이 딱 맞는 것 같아요. 저희의 매출의 거의 90%가 식비로 나가요. 그쵸, 많이 절약했죠. 그러니까.
While South Korea's fertility rate has steadily dropped over the years, Hwacheon County has managed to boost its birth rate. In 2022, it had a fertility rate of 1.4, double the 0.7 fertility rate in South Korea as a whole.
어느 나라건 어느 큰 도시든 작은 도시든 막론하고 형편은 똑같다. 다만 아이들 미래를 위해서 준비하는 게 다리를 놓는 게 중요한 거냐, 사람을 키우는 게 중요한 거냐.
Eunbyul's baby is one of the newest residents of Hwacheon. As she recuperates after giving birth to her second child, Eunbyul says she is far more at ease this time around than when she had her firstborn 7 years ago.
꼭 원장님께서 모유수유나 애기들 목욕법 같은 거 교육도 해주시고 또 산모들 이런 감정 이런 거 우울증 또 보건소에서 산모나 아니면 신생아 교육을 보건소 소아과 산부인과 과장님께서 오셔가지고 매일매일.
Eunbyul's 2-week stay is fully covered by the county. If she had had to pay, it would have cost her almost 2 million won, or around $1,300.
그런 예산 다 줄여갖고 아이들 키우는데 부족함이 없도록 집중적으로 투자하고.
Hwacheon's postpartum care center is fully booked for the next 8 months to welcome mothers and newborns, while Korea's overall birth rate is expected to slip even further this year.
처음엔 여기가 촌이다고 사람들이 그렇게 제가 화천 간 거에 대해서 이렇게 의아해했는데 지금은 다들 너무 부럽다고.
That's fascinating. Now, we want to get more insight. Let's bring in Dylan Motan, non-resident Kelly Fellow from the Research Institute Pacific Forum. Mr. Motan, welcome. Now, you heard there, Hwacheon fertility rate 1.4, that is double 0.7 for South Korea as a whole. Now, at a time when declining fertility rates are being described as a national crisis and an emergency, is even 1.4 good enough?
Of course, 1.4 is very far from the recommended 2.1. But South Korea is in such a dire situation that even 1.4 would be something of a miracle. There is a lot to learn from this Hwacheon case, but I'm not sure that Hwacheon represents the entire of Korea, in the sense that it's a small town where the prices of living and housing are quite lower. And I don't see the kind of recovery trend in the entire Korea for now. And the problem with this demographic crisis that we cannot solve is that it is having a terrible impact on the economy, because you understand clearly that the less people you have, the less worker you have, and then the less consumers you have. So like Japan before, the GDP growth will be extremely constrained. And another major problem which Japan doesn't have is that South Korea lives in a very dangerous environment with North Korea, China, Russia around. And South Korea needs to have a very strong military to defend itself. But with this decreasing number of people, the numbers of the Korean army are shrinking very fast, which is why the President Yoon Suk-yeol is seeing this as an existential crisis.
Yeah, so I guess it's important for the government to get to the root of the problem. Hwacheon approaches having children as an investment in their future, but it's not the case for the rest of South Korea, is it? How do you think young people there see family and children?
This is not a problem about willingness. I think young people still dream of having children in theory. But the problem is that on the ground, South Korea is a country where people are almost 80% university educated, which means that they will marry and get children extremely late, usually at the turn of the 30s or in their 30s. Also, the parents know, as you saw in the documentary, that they will have to send their children to private schools, very expensive. So they anticipate this kind of cost and so delay or even cancel childbirth. And you can add among this list the fact that in Korea still, for young women, having a child can seriously stop a career.
Yeah.
And it's very hard when you have a child to make a comeback for a woman
Understand.
private
It's
job
very
market.
difficult. It's very difficult. And but you saw, the couple in that story, 4 kids. They run a business comfortably. I realize that, Hwa-chon may not be reflective of the whole of South Korea, but I'm sure that they have a magic sauce or a formula that it's coaxing that high fertility. What did you observe there, or some other countries that you are familiar with?
In the entirety of Korea, like in Hwa-chon, the government has found a lot of money to help young couple in terms of loans, in terms of support for housing, even outright cash. But none of this has been working. So there's not only the problems I just talked about, but I think also there's a very deep societal conflict, really a gender divide among young men and young women, which are very clear in the surveys, in the sense that many young men still dream of a path where they would marry and then their wife would bear children and then stay at home. Meanwhile, young women have this dream of having a career and of being very independent, and maybe after having a child. So when you have this very conflicting situation, you actually have a very great number of women who actually gave up on dating because they don't want to have this burden of family bearing. Also because of a quite patriarchal society.
So are you saying then that declining fertility is a global trend that's inevitable? There seems to be a great resignation to that in the West, and that lying flat phenomenon in China, is it inevitable?
I wouldn't be that pessimistic because we have cases where countries recovered before. During the early 20th century, France had a very low fertility rate. Also, until like 2 decades ago, Russia was in a very deep demographic crisis. But when the government is willing to take political actions, you've seen cases where you can recover. But in the Korean case, my point is that it won't be only about throwing money to young people. It will be about a very broad reform of the entire social structure. As you saw in your documentary, reduce the burden posed by private schooling, but also a very general cultural change about the place of women in society and the relations between men and women, which are very polarized between conservative and progressive. It's a very deep divide that we need to bridge urgently.
So I'm hearing there is still hope. I would like to thank you, Dylan Motan from Pacific Forum. Coming up on East Asia tonight, South Korea bathes in a scorching heat wave with temperatures soaring to their highest since 2018. South Korea sweltered through its first 40-degree temperatures in 6 years on Sunday amid a relentless heat wave that has gripped the country since the end of July. After monsoon season, Korean authorities reported 5 heat-related fatalities over the weekend, taking the total number of such deaths recorded since May to 13. More than 1,500 illnesses from heat stress were also documented in the same period. Livestock also suffering from the high temperatures, with nearly 260,000 deaths, mostly of poultry. The Interior Ministry announced a $10.9 million budget to combat the heat wave, including the distribution of umbrellas and electric fans. It also upgraded its crisis response level to the highest last week, designating the heat wave as serious. Well, the heat is also affecting the agriculture in South Korea, with farmers now experimenting with growing fruits that typically are not found in the country.
맨 처음에는 과연 이것이 열릴까? 하여간 그런 그 호기심이 있었었는데 막상 우리가 키워가지고 열매가 열려지니까 아주 반갑고 좋았었죠. 그렇지만 그 뒷내면에는 기후위기가 아주 심각한 것 같다는 생각에 위기의식을 좀 느끼고 있어요.
South Korea is in a temperate zone with 4 distinct seasons, but since 2012, the country's annual temperature has been steadily climbing. Last year, the amount of rain during monsoon was double the annual average, resembling the weather conditions of a subtropical region.
바나나 같은 경우에는 이제 아열대 지방에서 많이 이제 재배가 되고 있는데 주로 이제 아열대 지방의 특징이라고 보면은 여름철에는 좀 고온 다습 이런 조건도 있고 그렇지만 겨울철에 이제 상당 부분 온도가 높기 때문에 바나나가 충분히 월동을 하고 그다음에 여름철에 이제 열매를 맺는 그런 조건을 좋아하게 되는데 서울에서 이렇게 바나나가 나왔다는 거는 결국은 우리나라가 아열대 지방과 비슷한 이런 기후 조건으로 되고 있다.
Experts, meanwhile, are suggesting that South Korea develops a variety of crops that can grow in rising temperatures. This is to ensure that farming regions are eventually prepared for a warmer climate. Well, around 2,000 Singaporeans live, work and play in southern China's Guangdong province. Even fewer choose to go off the beaten path in China. Now, this National Day, CNA's Tan Se-hui goes on a journey in search of a Singaporean who has displayed extraordinary Singapore spirit to start a fruit farm far away from home.
I'm in the southern city of Guangzhou to make the trip down to Maoming, a coastline city facing South China Sea with a population of around 6 million and known for its fruit production. I'm heading there to meet a fellow Singaporean. I hop on the high-speed train, which takes about 2.5 hours to reach Maoming. On my way, I spot a familiar face.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Here. Yes. What a coincidence. You're on the same train.
Yeah. Singaporean Justin Low currently resides in Shenzhen and first stepped foot in China in 2002, looking to venture into its fast-growing property market. 4 years later, he opened a farm in Huazhou, a county-level city under the administration of Maoming, which is about 400 kilometers away from Guangzhou City.
So Justin, could you tell us why did you choose to set up a farm in Maoming? It's so far, it's about 2.5 hours ride on the train.
The important thing is Maoming weather. The average temperature is 23 degrees Celsius. Another thing is Maoming has a lot of land. Then the labor is cheaper compared to Guangzhou. Shenzhen is cheaper.
We soon arrived in Maoming, but it was another 2-hour drive to Huazhou. It was a bumpy ride before finally reaching our destination, an oasis of golden sweet drops. What started out as a 100-hectare venture 2 decades ago has now grown 10 times the size. Justin has help from around 100 workers who harvest the farm's yearly output of around 600,000 kilograms of longan and lychee. These fruits are what Justin enjoys eating at home in Singapore, so he wanted a hand at growing them here.
China just started the time. Hiroshima just started. That's why I chose here. But Guangdong population, the time is maybe around 100 million. I saw the infusion, the big market in China.
What kind of challenges did you experience at first when you first arrived here and started the farm?
I'm not familiar with the village. Another thing is, I have no technician here. I'm not learned before how to be a farmer. Take maybe 3 to 4 years to learn.
3 to 4 years?
No, starting. It's quite tough for my start.
The fruits are packed and delivered to 50 cities across China, including Beijing, Chengdu, and Chongqing. While he doesn't export these longan to Singapore due to competition from neighbouring Thailand, it's the Singapore brand that takes him far.
Singapore brand, I don't listen here. It's more convenient for me. They trust me. Yes, for example, I want to work with you.
He also has advice for aspiring young Singaporeans who want to eke out a living in China.
You need to have a good relation here and they're hardworking. Work for 15 hours.
Every year, Justin will host a group of around 20 Singaporeans who wish to switch up city life for a sweet taste of fresh lychees and rural life, an experience hard to find in their island home. Meanwhile, back in Guangzhou, preparations are well underway for this year's National Day celebrations. A food fair is set to take place on the 9th of August, featuring a variety of Singaporean flair like chicken rice, laksa, and durian. Some 5,000 people, both mainland Chinese and Singaporeans, are expected to attend the event held at China's Singapore Guangzhou Knowledge City.
So this is the best time for them to come and join us, and see, National Day, so big, and what you have, this and that, So they are very excited to know more about Singapore.
Organisers are also planning a cultural exhibition to showcase places of interest in Singapore, such as the Malayan, Marina Bay Sands, and Katong. Tan Su-Wei, CNA, Guangzhou.
Well, that's East Asia Tonight for this Tuesday. Singapore viewers, stay tuned for the highlights from Paris 2024 Olympics.
Hello, I'm Paul Singh with your Olympic update. The first quarter-final for the women's volleyball was a gripping match as Turkey prevailed over China to advance to the semi-finals. Things started off heated with Turkey star striker Vargas pitted against China's Great Wall. The Chinese team edged ahead to win the first set 25-23. Turkey quickly found their momentum, with the Sultans of the net thundering ahead to win the next two sets. China fought back to regain control, taking the fourth set and pushing the match into the final tiebreaker. Breaths were held as both teams raced to 15 points. In the end, a victory for the women in red and white. Turkey won the last set 15-12. The knockout stage for women's handball is here. After missing the last two Olympics, Denmark will be advancing to the semi-finals. The Netherlands started off strong, leading 4-0 within the first 5 minutes of the game. The Danes, meantime, put up an impressive comeback, from being down 7-10 to scoring 8 goals without giving the Dutch a chance to respond. Denmark won 29-25, kicking Netherlands out of the competition. The Danes will be up against the winner of the Norway and Brazil match that's happening later tonight. In the men's basketball quarterfinals, Germany won the game against Greece. Germany was down 10 after the first quarter, with Greek Antetokounmpo having a huge impact. In the second quarter, Germany erased the deficit from the first with a 25-15 score. At halftime, the game was tied 36-36. Germany managed to overtake in the second half to end the game 76-63. Teams action in table tennis in the men's. China took on India, winning all 3 matches 3-0. Again, in the men's, Croatia played South Korea. The Koreans won all the matches to receive the overall score of 3-0. In the women's, it was United States versus Germany. Germany won the doubles match and the second match 3-0. A US win in the third match took the game to its fourth, where the Americans equalized. A fifth match was needed to break the tie, with Annette Kaufmann delivering for the Germans. Final score 3-2. Again in the women's, Australia took on Chinese Taipei. Chinese Taipei won the doubles match 3-0, followed by another decisive win in the second match. A 2-3 comeback by Australia in the third match wasn't enough, handing Chinese Taipei the win. In the women's 5,000 meters, Beatrice Chebet of Kenya won the Olympic gold in spectacular form. In what could be described as a showdown of the fastest women in history, Chebet surged ahead of her compatriot Faith Kipyegon in the final stretch, finishing a time of 14 minutes 28.56 seconds.
The Olympic champion at 5,000 in the greatest field ever assembled, and it is Beatrice Chebet Kipyegon.
In a dramatic turn of events, Kipyegon was initially disqualified after a clash with Ethiopian Gustav Sige. But after an appeal, she was reinstated and awarded the silver medal. Tokyo 2020 champion Typhoon Pesan of the Netherlands secured the bronze. The tug-of-war between the US and China continues on the medal tally. The two rivals have the same number of gold medals, but the Americans edged out the Chinese competitors by the number of silver and bronze medals. Host nation France is in third place with 48 medals. And that's the latest from the Olympic desk. Don't forget there's non-stop action live and on demand for free with MediaCorp on MeWatch.